When it all seeped out towards the end of 2015 that Australian Special Forces might have been guilty of atrocities in Afghanistan, it must have been pretty tempting to sweep it under the carpet on the basis of what goes on tour stays on tour. After all, they were our heroes and they were fighting a vicious enemy with no respect for the rules. I don't think I've caught up with anyone who's worn our country's uniform in recent years where this inquiry, the Brereton inquiry, hasn't ended up a topic of conversation and concern. So it's to the credit of our senior military commanders that they chose not to just make these rumours go away, instead resolved to get to the bottom of the bad, as well as the good, that our troops in Afghanistan had done. A country, Afghanistan, let's not forget, when ruled by the Taliban, were terrorists sheltered and trained, where the dignity of human life, women and girls in particular, was non-existent. Now, 4 and a bit years on from these rumours, we now have a report, released today by the Chief of the Defence Force, General Angus Campbell. As you might expect, for the purposes of operational security, but also to ensure the right of those involved to a fair trial, there's a lot of identifying detail in this report that's properly not made public. But what we do know from this most meticulous of investigations is that some 25 serving and current members, serving and former members of our Special Forces, have been implicated in 39 unlawful killings while in operations in Afghanistan, with 19 of them now referred to a special investigator for likely criminal prosecutions. That's out of the 25,000 plus, let's never forget, who served in theatre over 12 years. As the Defence Chief today made clear, these were not killings in the heat of battle, of people who later turned out to be non-combatants. These were deliberate after-action killings of enemy in custody. Shamefully, it seems, some young soldiers were forced to carry out executions as a form of blooding. Now, it's quite right, it's absolutely right, that all those hit by these allegations should swiftly be charged and be given the right to defend themselves. Of course, the right to defend themselves. If found guilty, beyond reasonable doubt, the usual criminal standard in matters like this, they must then face the full consequences of the law. We could have not gone into Afghanistan in order to uphold the rule of law and to protect civilian lives if we don't hold ourselves as Australians to that same standard. The dangers to our soldiers' own lives and the atrocities that were perpetrated against them cannot justify atrocities in payback. Australian soldiers have to be better than that. We can't fight barbarism with barbarism, even though context may be a mitigating factor in any sentencing. But before we jump to conclusions about our soldiers and about our involvement in Afghanistan, let's recall that these atrocities only came to light because numerous serving members of the SAS Regiment and the Commando Regiment blew the whistle on those amongst them who had failed to live up to our country's ideals. So while some of our military heroes today may turn out to have had very deep flaws, as well as great courage, we should never doubt that there were heroes there, even in those killing fields. Those whistleblowers whose courage turned out to be moral as well as just physical. Before we conclude that there's something wrong with the so-called culture of our Special Forces, let's recall that this same culture also produced those men of honour and moral courage who spoke up, as well as a relatively small number whose moral compass had become deranged. I think former Commando Major Heston Russell today helped explain how inadequate so-called simple solutions are when it comes to questions of culture.
I think it's very key to note that our Special Forces served with absolute distinction, valour and courage during some of the most gripping situations I myself have lived through and seen men adopt a warrior culture that saw them serve each other with purpose, not fear for their own lives in service of their country. Saw some of our most magnificent warriors die in the heat of battle. the correct application and transition of that culture back to what is required outside of combat may definitely have been a difficult time for some people. The true test of culture is during crisis, and I got to see some individuals and teams perform to the most magnificent levels of human courage and sacrifice. At the same time, war and exposure to such conflict can indeed corrupt and bring out the worst, and we've seen that, and we're now dealing with that.
To my mind, rather than obliterating the warrior culture that has made our special forces so widely admired and so effective, or subjecting combat soldiers to even more institutional scrutiny or even more complicated rules of engagement, aren't we best served by just weeding out anyone in uniform who might be tempted to think they're above the law and that the rules don't apply to them? Or better yet, not recruit them in the first place. To me, saying that soldiers who did the wrong thing were victims of culture sounds more like an excuse rather than demanding that they accept personal responsibility for this wrongdoing. Wrongdoing that every good soldier, look at the ones who spoke out, knew was unacceptable. But even after today's statement by the CDF and the release of a redacted version of the Brereton report, there are still plenty of questions left. Is it entirely credible that no senior commanders had any inkling of anything untoward in these famous units that have now had their campaign citations taken away? If so, they must have been remarkably out of touch, and if in fact senior officers were dismissive of what are now known to be atrocities, there should be some serious consequences for them as well. Then there's the fact that the burden of the actual fighting was borne by so few. Some of those implicated did 5 or more 6-month-plus tours of duty and were in the field on hunter-killer missions, mostly at night. It was hardly the culture of the unit that was to blame, but it may have been the policy, government policy, defence policy, of only putting special forces into combat to minimise infantry casualties that turned some into killing machines. I'm not excusing it, but I'm adding some context. Or at least we might have ended up with men that lost touch with reality or the ideals of honour they once signed on to uphold. For all that, the obvious determination of our military to stamp this out and General Campbell's obvious contrition for the wrongs done and an apology. How often do we not see that in public life? Well, all of that today is entirely in keeping with our nation's best ideals. I've always been incredibly proud working in government alongside the military. I've had family members going back to my great-great-grandfather who fought alongside his 5 brothers on the Western Front and a grandfather wounded in New Guinea. It's a story common, I know, to so many Australians, and I suspect that's in part why this report today has touched a nerve with us all. Part of the pride we all have in our military is confidence that as Australians, we are big enough to own our mistakes. As Charles Bean put it so beautifully about the original Anzacs, what these men did, nothing can alter now. The good and the bad. The greatness and the smallness of their story will stand. It rises as it always will rise, a monument to great-hearted men, and for their nation, a possession forever.